This is the Graceful Atheist podcast. Welcome to the Graceful Atheist podcast. My name is David, and I am trying to be the Graceful Atheist. Well, this time around, instead of begging for ratings and reviews, I wanted to thank the people who have already done so. I want to specifically thank Maria56, H Camps02, and Susan for doing a review in the last couple of months. That really helps people to find the podcast. Thank you for supporting the podcast by rating and reviewing it in the Apple Podcast Store or wherever you get your podcasts. I'd like to introduce a new idea for the podcast, and that is to send in questions that you would like to hear me answer. There are a myriad of apps out there that will allow you to record your voice, including the Anchor app that this podcast is produced on. That can send it to me directly. But if just on your phone you do an app, you can send it via email at gracefulatheist@gmail.com, and I'll add it into the podcast and answer your questions. Also, just another reminder, if you have gone through the deconversion process and you want to share your story, please get in touch with me at gracefulatheist@gmail.com. On to today's show. Today's show is one that I didn't know I needed to have, and I am so excited to share it with you. At the beginning of the podcast, I had this idea that I would have Christians in my life do an interview of me, and I'd be able to respond to their questions directly. Well, we're a year and a half or so into the podcast so far, and that just hasn't materialized. And the Christians that I've had on the podcast, I've done more of the interviewing of them. I still am holding out hope that I'll have such a conversation in the future. But ironically, the most curious person that I've had so far about my story is a friend of mine named Bryce, who has been a lifelong atheist. We get into his story as well of growing up as a non-believer in the midst of believers all around him and the loneliness and the isolation that he feels. But also because Bryce and I have been friends for a number of years and he knew me when I was a Christian, he was amazed when I told him that I had deconverted. And so you hear that in this podcast, and you hear his curiosity about the big questions. One of the things I think I've learned over the years here is that even for people who have gone through deconversion or who call themselves atheists, not everyone is interested in these subjects, in these topics. Bryce clearly is. He shows a really insightful level of questioning that you're about to hear. So anyway, this is one of my favorite episodes because it's mostly about me. But I do want you to see and listen to Bryce's perspective. Bryce is not one of those atheists who's online trolling people. You could not describe Bryce as a part of new atheism. This was a part of him from childhood, and you are going to hear the innocence of the questions that he asks. If you're a believer, I am asking you not to be offended and just listen to the questions that he's asking. They're really important. If you've been a lifelong atheist, I think you'll recognize them. And if you've been through the deconversion process, I think you'll appreciate the level of insightfulness that Bryce shows in these questions. And now I give you my conversation with Bryce Harrington. Bryce Harrington, welcome to the Graceful Atheist podcast.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So Bryce, you are the dubious honoree of being the second person who I actually know in real life to be on the podcast. The reason I have you on is that, you and I have worked together on and off at a couple of different companies. And way back, all the way in 2012, you and I had a really interesting conversation. I think we were in an airport for an ungodly amount of time. And we got to talking, and that's when I mentioned to you that I was a Christian at the time. And our conversation, which we'll get into in just a minute, really stuck with me for a long time. And you might know that in 2015, then I went through a deconversion process and lost my faith. And so I've asked you on because I want to kind of explore what I was thinking at that time and then what happened after that. And just recently pulled you aside and said, hey, I've got some interesting news to tell you. So you've been kind of there at both ends of the extremes, and I think you've been a good friend in that process, and I really appreciate you.
Sure. Yeah, that was an amazing conversation. It's really important to me too. I've known a lot of religious people through my life, like really well,
Right.
but I've not been religious myself. And so
Yes.
I've always been kind of torn with that question of like, why do people believe this? And what is it? What's going on with these religious people that they are so fervently believing in this thing that I don't believe in?
Exactly.
And so yeah, that conversation that I had with you finally it was like, oh, I get it. Okay, I understand why people are religious, and it makes sense. And it's good that David is religious. And so I went away from that conversation. It was, I don't know, a couple hours that we talked. We did some deep, deep stuff.
Yeah.
And I went away with that of like a better understanding and appreciation of religion than I had before that. And so then, yeah, last year when you said I'm an atheist, I was like, what?
Exactly.
David?
Yeah. What happened?
So you've crushed my whole worldview.
I know. I ruined everything.
So yeah, so I'm really curious.
Before we get to that really quickly, I think the question that immediately comes to mind is, how were you raised? When did you decide that you did not believe?
I came from a pretty typical, I guess, religious background. Like my extended family was all religious Baptists.
Okay.
My parents, we went to church. They moved from Portland to Salem, and in that process, they switched from being Baptist to Methodist, and we switched churches. And my parents also, my dad worked a night shift. My mom was an ER nurse. So their schedule was really crazy. So our church attendance was super irregular. So that gave me not a complete religious raising or whatever.
Yeah.
So it gave me a lot of time to kind of think about these things and have kind of space away from church and whatever.
Right.
But yeah, it was very early on. I remember when we had moved to Salem, my parents had me go to a neighbor's house who was having a Sunday school kind of event.
Yeah.
And so she'd invited all the neighborhood kids over. And I remember, this has always stuck with me. She sat us down. She says, "Okay, children, are you ready to accept Jesus into your hearts today?"
Yes.
And I was like, okay, who's this Jesus guy and what's he want with my internal organs?
Yes.
And so I said no.
Yeah.
And of course, for her, she's mortified. Like, what?
Yeah.
So she said, "Who said that?" And I'm like, uh-oh, what did I say?
Right.
And I didn't say anything. I just shrunk into my coat or into my shirt. But the most amazing thing happened. This kid behind me, who I swear had said yes, he said, "I said that."
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so that kid was stood up, walked out of that room, and I never saw him again. And now as an adult, I can understand what happened. It's like, the woman didn't want to press us, and she didn't want to make anybody have to sit through something they didn't want to sit through. And so that kid probably went off to the playground and had a great day and whatever. Right. But for me, sitting there is like, oh my God, what did I just do?
Wow.
What is this that I'm in? Yeah. And I don't remember anything else about that Sunday school session, but I never went back. And so I think my parents asked me how things went. I'm like, oh, it's crazy. All this stuff happened.
Yeah.
Anyway, so that's like my earliest memory of religion, of just being like, okay, I don't jive with whatever's going on here. Something weird is going on. And so growing up, I always felt like everybody else was in on the secret, and they believed this thing, and I didn't know why. I didn't understand what the whole thing was. It was very confusing to me. So like I said, our church attendance was very irregular. But I had an uncle that he's very religious, and he sent me I was a big reader, and so he sent me a Bible. And so as a good reader, I started at the beginning, even though the book actually said, I remember it said, don't read this from the start to finish. Read like a chapter of the Old Testament and a chapter of the New Testament.
Yeah.
Balance it out. No, I didn't do that. And from a marketing point of view, that's, the Bible, like, it starts with kind of a hard
It's
sell,
rough.
right?
It's a rough read. Yeah.
It's a rough read. And I think we talked about that in our conversation.
Yeah.
So I didn't make it all the way through the Old Testament, but I remember getting to Noah's Ark, which is my favorite part of the Bible, and reading it. And I had been reading a lot of fantasy science fiction stuff, Narnia and whatever. And so to me, it was like, oh, it's, a mythological story. It's really interesting. There's angels and, floods and great catastrophe. It's like dragons and wizards and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Anyway, so at one of these church Sunday schools that I went to, I saw there was a teacher from the previous class was cleaning up, and they were teaching like Joseph or something, and I saw that they had some Noah's Ark stuff. I'm like, oh, I can finally ask someone that's an expert.
Yeah.
And so I started asking all the typical questions about Noah's Ark, like, were all the animals there? What about, blah, blah, what do they eat? And, blah, 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 blah. I remember her saying, Bryce, don't ask so many questions.
Yes.
Which I totally get, It's a poor woman who just wants to get to her job and get back to whatever she's doing. But to me, it was like, oh my God, like the experts can't even answer these basic questions.
Yeah.
So it kind of put me on a path of like not asking questions, at least not verbally.
Right.
And I felt very alone. Like everybody else in my family that I knew was religious, but I couldn't share with them at all about these questions that I had or these feelings. And so I went through a lot of my childhood with this kind of weird relationship with religion of like, I just didn't get it. It just didn't make any sense to me. And everybody around me seemed to be just totally bought into it. I just didn't understand why.
Yeah. You've said just several amazing things in that description. The first I want to say is that the greatest counter-apologetics arguments ever come from children, right? Just your simple questions that could not get a sufficient answer for a child, yourself at that time. That is the problem, right? But then you experience the other side of this, which is the social pressure to believe. And you learned that lesson intuitively, that you don't ask these questions because they don't want to hear the questions, and they don't have answers. So it's just amazing to me. Like your story, I think, is important as well for the people that grow up in religious households who don't have faith and feel the kind of isolation that you're describing.
Yeah, and I'm sure a lot of people they must go through a lot of the same questioning and doubts and stuff.
Yeah.
It didn't occur to me at the time, but I was probably not alone. There's probably a lot of people just like me. You know? I had learned the word agnostic, and that was my safety word. And I realized that I could get through life, just I'm agnostic.
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot of people that weren't really, I don't know, they wouldn't say that about themselves, but maybe they were.
Yeah. I say this all the time. I guarantee that there's a significant percentage of people sitting in pews who don't believe, right? They are going through the motions because of social pressure, or the thing that I say that religion does really well is build community. And maybe they've made that exchange. They will exchange community for ignoring the supernatural claims they can't believe in. And I think that happens much more often than people understand, right? People in churches understand.
Yeah, that's really interesting. That is something that I've noticed myself going to church with my parents, even up until through high school. I did notice that there was like, it's the one unique kind of place where it's just kind of like an extended family, a community family, and everybody accepts each other as being part of this thing. And you don't get that. Like as an atheist, I don't get that anywhere else.
That's true. And one of the things I'm obsessed with is, I call myself a humanist now, and maybe we'll get into this more. What I recognized was I've always been a humanist. I was a religious humanist as a believer, and now I'm a secular humanist as a non-believer. But what that means to me is putting people over ideology, caring about people, the social gospel, actually feeding the poor, housing the homeless. actually boots on the ground, connecting and meeting people's needs, right? And what I've come to learn is that that need for community, that need to be a part of a group and to feel a sense of belonging is hardwired, a human need. And so I'm obsessed with finding humanist ways to build community. I'm not good at it, but this podcast is an attempt at doing that as well, in recognition that not just people like ourselves who say, well, I'm an atheist and have no problem with that term, but also all the people who mark none of the above, and are just kind of quote unquote spiritually homeless. We need to find community building ways to connect those kinds of people.
Yeah. So I have some questions.
Okay. All right.
So first of all, I saw a few things on your looking at some blog posts and stuff, that there have been some questions about, like, okay, if you don't believe if you're an atheist now, then you were never a true believer, true Christian before.
Yeah.
Which makes me laugh. Like, I haven't talked to you.
Yes. Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Hey, believers listening, Bryce is my testimony of my former faith.
I have known a lot of religious people, and David for sure was, I don't know what the word is. I don't like to use the word true believer.
Yeah.
But you had very well thought out rationale for all your beliefs, and they made sense. I mean, you had a very logical approach to, and you knew things. I mean, you've read the Bible how many times?
Not that many, 4 or 5 times, probably all the way through, but yeah.
Yeah, that's a lot.
Yeah.
But anyway, so my question is, do you think when people ask that question, if it's not so much about you, but about themselves?
Absolutely. I think that's an insightful observation. It is the most common reaction. Again, because these are the kinds of things that I care about, I'm often in social media reading blog posts from believers and non-believers around these subjects. And very recently, and you may not have even noticed this, but there's been a rash of very high-profile people, meaning famous people. They're famous worship leaders or authors, or in one case, some YouTube personalities that have deconverted very publicly. And so there is a rash of apologists, the kinds of people who try to defend Christianity, who have responded to these high-profile deconversions, and their descriptions almost always say they were doing it wrong. They'll find some nitpicky point where they will say, well, they didn't study enough, or they're being too intellectual and not spiritual, right? So it doesn't matter what reasons the deconvert gives, the apologist finds some reason why that is not valid. But the big one is, I just doubt that they had a real faith, a real trust in Jesus, right? They didn't experience God the way I do. And that is the most common response by far and away. And I think your insight is an important one. And in particular, I find adult deconversions, as opposed to, your 18-year-old, your 20-year-old who just decides, this is not for me. But, somebody who's lived this out for a while and they deconvert, that is actually saying something very significant. And in order to put the cognitive dissonance at bay, the easiest out is to just say they never had any real faith.
Yeah, it's kind of fascinating, because if you approach it from a point of view of, well, it's all kind of a self-delusion to begin with, right? Mm-hmm. So true belief is really just like, you are very, very, very deluded. I mean, that's insulting, but from my perspective, it's that. So for someone to say that, where you weren't, a true believer, you weren't, really doing things right, it's just so ridiculous, because it's like, to me, it means you were thinking too much. You were asking too many questions. You were having some doubts. And I think anything that can't survive being questioned is probably not true. It's probably not worth believing in. You know what I mean?
I absolutely do. I often say that even in my conversation with you, my belief at the time was that if my faith couldn't withstand scrutiny, it wasn't worth anything. So I was fine with our discussion and even any potential criticisms that you had at the time. And I felt that my faith was robust enough to withstand that. Spoiler alert, after, after quite some time, it didn't survive that. But I agree with you entirely. I just had a conversation with a gentleman by the name of John Marriott, who works at Biola University, and he studied deconversion from the Christian perspective. And he is much kinder as far as the reasons that he gives for why deconversions occur. But still, at the end of the day, what he is missing is that if it were true, no one would deconvert, right? If it were true, that it would withstand scrutiny. The fact that it does not indicates something about its truth value.
Yeah. It'd be an interesting thought puzzle to go through. Like, what if God and Jesus actually did exist?
Yes.
What would the world actually be like? Like from a logical perspective, like think it out. Like if there was a God and there was Jesus, how would the world work?
Mm.
And then you just come up with like, well, why is it like this? I mean, why do we have cancer for children? Why do we have, mosquitoes? There's like all these things that if there was actually a design, things wouldn't work the way they do.
I could not agree with you more. And again, this is when I talk to believers who are open to having, a critical discussion. That is my tack. It is an internal critique. The
Right.
God that I believed in is bigger than the neutered, powerless God that apologists proclaim, right? I believed in a God of miracles, a God of intervening in the physical world. And it was the process of being honest with myself about the lack of intervention, the lack of evidence of a God who actually acts in the real world. That honesty started to build up until the point I could no longer believe in that big God that I thought must exist.
Yeah.
Ted Chiang, who is the author of the short story that Arrival, the movie, was built on, as a anthology of short stories that the story Arrival is based on, which happens to be called Stories of Your Life, is in. He has another story in there called Hell is the Absence of God. And I don't know what Ted Chiang's purpose in writing that was, but basically he ran this experiment.
Yeah.
What if there was some generic theistic God who intervened in the world, in the modern world? And in this story, there were scientists who would, when a miracle would happen, there would be positive effects and negative effects. Things would be destroyed, people would be healed. Scientists would come in and study it, and they'd statistically analyze it, and they'd make these reports. The government would come up with reports about this event or that event.
Yeah.
And that simple thought experiment of what would the world, the universe look like if actually a theistic God did exist is very, very powerful.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's teleport back to 2012 for a second. We were in that airport.
San Francisco, right?
Yeah, I believe so. Yeah, or Oakland, one or the other. Let me just set it up. I think we were starting to bond over, we both had young children. We were both dads with young kids. And we were talking about gratitude. This is what started the conversation.
Okay.
We're so grateful that our children were healthy. The experience of being a dad and trying to figure life out for yourself and your children. And I distinctly remember the reason we got into spiritual conversation at all was I was thinking, I am thankful to someone. And I don't know if Bryce is. And that is why I started to bring up the spiritual conversation.
Huh. But I remember we were walking down the hall and I said, God damn it. And then I apologized to you. I was, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
And I remember you saying, oh, no, it's okay. It doesn't bother me. I think you said, in fact, I like talking about belief systems or something like that.
Yeah.
Like you were really fascinated by talking about that. And that was kind of like, a magic opening for me. It was like, oh,
yeah.
I got some questions for you.
Exactly.
That's how I remember the conversation starting.
All right. I remember that part of it too. And I was trying to convey to you, like, I want you to be honest and not
Yeah.
filter yourself when you talk to me. Like, I'm not going to be offended by your honest questions or your honest, like a curse word or two. I was trying to, again, present the best picture of myself at the time. But I'm curious if you recall what your first thoughts were when I said I'm a Christian.
I may have known that beforehand.
Okay.
Like I said, I've known lots of religious people through my life, as a lot of people have. And I didn't know what type of Christian you were,
Right.
how strict you were about things, if you got offended by things, if you didn't like being asked questions, or
Right.
I didn't know any of that. So for you to say, hey, I'm open to talk about this, it was like, oh, okay, that is, that's interesting. So that was my reaction. So the fact that you were Christian or not didn't really register. I mean,
Okay.
some people are, and that's fine. But you were a type that I could talk to.
Yeah. Yes.
I like that.
And little did you know you were falling into my trap, because I felt obligated to be a representative of the gospel and engage you in conversation. So.
Well, another thing is I didn't feel like you were had any intention to try to convert me,
Yeah.
And I certainly didn't have any intention to shake your faith or anything like that.
Right.
And so I felt like our conversation was very just kind of equal, hey, let's share our different viewpoints on things and pass some time.
Right. What I remember about it, and the thing that kind of nagged me, was I think we had some discussion about design, some of the issues you've already brought up. And I was very hand-wavingly trying to describe a way in which God could participate in evolution. And you were rightly pointing out that there's just no evidence for that. And I was struggling to explain why I still thought that was the case. And and what I've come to understand today, 2020, David, is there's this cognitive dissonance or a special pleading that happens that says the evidence that I see or I have is valid, and your negative evidence or your disconfirming evidence is invalid, and that is just a super strong feature of being a human being.
Yeah.
And that this happens in all kinds of other contexts as well.
Sure. Yeah.
You were asking just very kind, very straightforward questions, but that I honestly didn't have an answer, even if I gave you an answer at the time. With, again, 2020 hindsight, I can see that I was struggling to come up with a rational, solid answer to the questions that you had. And like I say, that nagged me for a while. So,
well, in that conversation, what I was after was not so much, the evidentiary stuff and what do you believe versus that, but more of just the mindset and how you approach things and the way that you think. I was really interested in just how you create and establish your worldview. And I think you did a really good job of, and what the value was that you saw in the particular, in religion, and in particular your faith. What was the value you were getting out of,
right.
Because whether or not it's true or false, if you're getting value out of it, that's something.
Yeah.
And so you really convinced me that you did see value for you and in your belief, that you were getting something that you would be missing otherwise out of it, which made a lot of sense to me. I mean, that really kind of changed my view of things a little bit. It doesn't necessarily matter if you're right or wrong. You think about what does the person need?
Yeah.
In terms of value. And it's not important for us to always be right or wrong. It's important for us to feel like we're good people and that, have a purpose in life, and, a lot of bigger things that aren't really based on true or false. They're based on values.
Absolutely. And part of what I'm doing here with this Graceful Atheist thing is, we went through the four horsemen, right? Sam Harris and Dawkins. And there was a pretty long period of time where the atheist community was pure reason. We are right and you're wrong and you people are stupid for thinking this. And I think we're over that now. That's not just me. But part of what I want to say is that because I remember what it was like to believe, I want to be very kind to people who are believers.
Yeah.
And the things that you've just mentioned are really critical. You get kind of a built-in sense of purpose. We talked about community earlier. You have a sense of community, and you do have a sense of a shared sense of values that you get just for free with whatever religion you happen to pick. And that can stop you from looking at the evidence or the truth value of the things that you say that you believe. I guess what I'm saying is I'm not interested in sweeping the rug out of people who still believe, right? Like including much of my family who are all very much still believers. I perceive that a few of them, it would be hurting them to take that away from them. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
And so I am not concerned with proving them wrong. And I'm just concerned with caring about them because I love them. They're my family. And so that's kind of the message that I try to get across is like, I care about truth. The truth is what led me into Christianity, and truth is what led me out. And it's important that we stand up for what things are true and acknowledge untrue things, to say they are not true. But ultimately, people matter, and caring about people includes, again, I'm using scare quotes, spirituality, however you define that. We mean something when we say spirituality, some kind of feeling or some sense of awe or some tradition or ritual or something that's meaningful to us, and snatching that away from people isn't helping them.
So now one thing I want to ask you about that we talked about
Yeah.
was the I forget the word for it, the spiritual revelation that you feel like God is talking to you, like you have this experience. Some people, some religious people have this experience, and you described it to me really well, and it stuck with me. And I didn't understand. I mean, I've never had anything like that of just this like warmth of, there being some other being talking to you. But I accept that there are people that, however, they have that feeling.
Right.
Now that you've become an atheist, how do you view that experience that you had?
That is a beautiful question. It's because it's really important. I now have the language to describe that I didn't before. For the listeners who weren't a part of that conversation, I was describing an event where I was specifically an event where there was an evangelist and he was talking and he said, something that I really felt was about me. And I had this overwhelming sense of warmth and presence and a sense of God's love, and that this was my mission in life to spread that feeling of love, that God loves people that much. So, I mean, it was profound. It was deeply moving. And it even to today, the graceful part of the Graceful Atheist is a callback to that in some ways, right? It was life altering. Now, on the other side of the equation, what I've learned is, number one, human beings experience awe. Awe is a thing not only that we experience, but we need that. If you're an atheist and you go mountain climbing or down by a beautiful waterfall or whatever you find beauty in, looking up at the stars, at the cosmos, and you have a sense of being small and something greater than yourself, it doesn't have to be supernatural, right? But that sense of awe is just something that human beings need.
Right.
And the trick, the part that is important, is that awe can be fabricated. We can create an environment for people to experience awe. And my best example of this is I happen to be privileged enough to have been in London, and I was in St. Paul's Cathedral.
I was just thinking of that.
Yeah, as an atheist. So, this is a few years ago. And I love the architecture, right? It's this beautiful cathedral. It's, giant flying buttresses, and the sense of awe, just as a person, as a human being, when you walk in, it is palpable. Now, believers will walk in and say, well, that's the presence of God. I'm thinking, man, the architects who built this were geniuses. Right? They really understood what they were trying to have a person experience when they walk in. Two, I've had a number of worship leaders that I've interviewed who will talk about almost a formulaic nature of, they could almost predict, right? I'm going to do this fast song and this medium song, and then I'm going to hit this slow song, and we're going to slow the song way down, and people are going to start raising their hands. And over time, they began to recognize that they were creating the environment in which people responded in a spiritual way. And then the last point is, and this is the language that I didn't learn until way later, is this idea of attribution. So we have this experience of awe that is very real, and it can be physical, that sense of warmth. So in other words, the experience is real.
Yeah.
Meaning something physical is actually happening.
Yeah.
The attribution of what is causing that is mistaken. And I heard a psychologist talk about this, and she was saying, we have these cognitive buckets that when we have an experience, the easiest thing is just to find the bucket that the experience goes in and put it in there. And anybody who is in the Western culture is swimming in Christian ideas, right? So we have this God bucket. We have this idea of a generic sense of what God is. So when we have this experience of awe, unless it is truly analyzed and thought about, we just put it in the God bucket. Right. And so that was my experience. I grew up in not a particularly religious home, and it wasn't until my teenage years that I became a dedicated Christian, but I already had that God bucket. I already had the framework to accept what was being told to me, and I just put it in the God bucket. And then I had these awe experiences, and those went in the God bucket, and they are self-reinforcing. Today, I recognize that my attribution was mistaken. That experience was real, but I attributed it to an external deity, and that was mistaken. I now can recognize when I'm standing on a mountain, or even when I go for a run, or just, there's certain times where I experience awe and I go, oh, this is a human experience.
It's interesting because I've had conversations with other very devout people, and they've described the same thing that you did.
Yeah.
And so I've never talked to someone after that has had that.
Yeah.
And after, and you're like, well, what was really going on there?
Right.
But you're right. It's a real experience that people have, and it must be amazing in the religious ceremony that is constructed in, as you say.
One other topic I wanted to talk about from that 2012 conversation you and I had, the other thing that you brought up that I had just never, ever considered, and I want to properly frame this because we're in a moment in time where framing is important, but you were talking about the discrimination towards atheists. The framing I want to say is that in no way are either of us suggesting that discrimination is comparable to what is taking place in the Black Lives Matter or LGBTQ and communities. But there is something truthful in that atheists do experience discrimination. And you talked about the loneliness that you felt as a growing up, but also moments in time where you didn't feel like you could talk about, hey, I'm an atheist.
Right.
And that hit me like I had never considered. I was a part of what we're seeing more and more of in our current politics, but of the default Christian American experience. And it had never occurred to me what it might be like for someone who wasn't a part of that and what their experience might be.
Yeah.
Do you remember talking about that? Do you still feel that way?
I do. And what's ironic is that growing up, two of my best friends were very religious. I mean, you'd call them evangelicals today.
Yeah.
They were very hardcore. They probably felt ostracized a bit themselves because they were so far extreme, religious, right, to where they had to sit out of classes and there were things they couldn't do, and they saw themselves as being very separate from everybody else. And they didn't see me as religious because I wasn't, but
right,
because I was so different, we could kind of connect and just kind of, not connect in a religious aspect, but just on school and other interests.
Being normal kids, yeah.
Yeah. So it's interesting that I guess the people I felt most excluded for were probably not the most hardcore religious people, but people that were kind of moderate religious, I guess, and that were maybe more uncertain themselves of their faith. And
Right.
so it was a difficult topic to have with them.
Yeah.
And I wonder if a lot of it may have been just me, just feeling like I was so different that I just had to sit down and shut up, and sit in church and not say a word and wonder what was going on. And
so again, Bryce, I think what you're saying there is just so important, because I guarantee there are young people experiencing that right now. And
yeah,
it breaks my heart that you felt alone at that time, and that anybody would feel left out that way. Right.
yeah. And I wonder about that kid that I told you about that stood up and said, it was me.
Yeah. Yes.
I said no.
Yeah.
Like, I want to be that kid, say, this is what I think.
Right.
It's okay. Let the dominoes fall as they may.
Yeah.
I kind of wish if I, could go back and just all the times that I felt like I couldn't say anything. Well, what if I did? Like the Thanksgivings where everybody's saying prayer. Like, I didn't have to pretend to pray. I suppose it'd be rude, but
that's an interesting topic, because I find myself in that scenario actually quite often, where I'm with a group and they pray.
Yeah.
They know not to ask me, but basically this is the way. Not everybody necessarily does this, but for me this works. I think this is a community building or a family building act. We are standing close to each other, we're expressing our care for one another. And I appreciate that they are all attributing this to a deity, and I am not, but I still care for them. And for me, it's okay. I know that there are many people who that is not okay, and it's triggering, or it's scary or threatening in some way. And I think each of us has to come to a decision on what we're willing to accept, where our boundary is, how far we're willing to go, that kind of thing.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing to balance. Like, you certainly should not be rude to other people.
Yeah.
But you should also not pretend to be somebody that you're not, just for someone else's sake.
Right.
And I found myself in that role from time to time, and it's very uncomfortable,
Yeah.
For example, with saying grace at dinner, like, I think it's more honest to just, quietly sit and wait for people to do it than to pretend to pray yourself, which is what I would often do.
Oh, I see. I just look around at the other people to see who else has got their eyes open. And I'm like, I see you.
I like that.
Yeah.
So, were there any other things we talked about in that conversation that stuck with you?
What struck me the most was how deeply caring you were for your children. And I thought, that is exactly what I feel for my children. And that was part of that bridge for me of recognizing, from today's hindsight, I would say, because that's a human experience. But at the time, it was important for me to recognize that our belief systems didn't matter, right? I recognized that you were a good dad and that you loved your children. And that had a profound impact against my prejudice, my assumptions or what have you.
What were your assumptions about atheists? Like, have you interacted with other atheists in the past? And what was your view before?
I'll answer that in a couple of ways. One is that the evangelical church in particular will often talk about atheists as very lost. They will talk about them as having no morals and no purpose. And
yeah, I picked that up when I was a kid. It was like, great Uncle John, his marriage is failing and he's divorced, and some say he's a homosexual, but thank God he's not an atheist.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
Exactly. Yeah. So there's an aspect of that, of the culture I was in fighting that. My whole thing was always about grace. It was about loving people, which included atheists. So, I was interested in how can I care about people, and I didn't have that much contact with atheists. So the second part of the answer is, I worked with a guy in the 2007 timeframe who was an atheist, and we would have these same kinds of conversations. And he'd be a little more challenging, but we were kind. We respected each other. We cared about each other. Around the same time, I think I read Sam Harris's The End of Faith. And this is the other very slippery cognitive dissonance. Reading Sam, I just thought, this is an angry person. You know what I mean? And by just dismissing his arguments by saying this is an angry person, that was mostly the category that I had, or the perception I had of atheists, that these are people who are angry. Maybe implicitly and explicitly, the church teaches this, that atheists are angry at God. When a very devout evangelical says atheist, what they mean is someone who knows that God exists but hates him and doesn't want to. It never occurs to them that what we are actually saying is that no, God does not exist at all, and that is a revelation, right? Now I knew that at the time, but that's in the background, right? Those are the background cultural influences and trying to overcome them. But again, something about recognizing the very normal humanity in you broke through whatever prejudices I did have, and that was a significant thing.
Yeah. For me to switch from calling myself agnostic to atheist, I distinctly remember this. I was in college. I was I had just graduated. I was in aerospace engineering, and I had just started my first job in aerospace engineering, and I was out to lunch with some of my coworkers, and one of the coworkers said that she was agnostic, and the other one said, and maybe he was joking, but he said, well, how can you have any morals? And I was just like, oh my God, are you kidding me?
Yeah.
And so I came out and said, well, I'm atheist and I have morals.
Yeah.
And, it's like the least challenging way to come out as an atheist. Here I have completed schooling, absolutely no one in the world is going to be at all surprised that I'm an atheist at this point. But, to me, it was kind of like, finally I'm standing up and walking out of that lady's Sunday school.
It's a big deal, man.
It is. It's hard.
I'm feeling for you so much. It doesn't matter if you're an adult, you figured out who you are and what you actually think. And so ironically, some of the things from the religious tradition that they are true. Things like the truth will set you free. Being honest about yourself, whether that's an LGBTQ person coming out of the closet or being an atheist and being open about that, is freeing. It's cathartic. This is a human thing. We need to be
accept each other, accept ourselves.
Exactly. Yeah. And integrous, being internally, who I am internally, externally, so that other people are accepting the real me rather than some facade that I put out there.
Okay. So finally, let's get into the stuff I really want to know.
Okay. Sounds good.
Okay. 2012, we had this conversation. We go on our separate ways. What happens, David, after that? How did you go from that point to being an atheist and to start a podcast? Tell me how you went through this.
Yes. So I'll repeat something that I've said multiple times. My listeners will be bored with this, but a good friend of mine by the name of Matthew Taylor, when he was describing his deconversion, he said, I suddenly was aware that I could no longer believe. And the suddenly describes my awareness, but not the process. The process took a very long time. So with hindsight, I can look back at my conversations way back in 2007, reading Sam Harris's book, my conversation with you in 2012. Shortly after that, I did another read through of the Bible. And it's funny, I tell this story a lot, but my wife would be like, you're angry. Why are you angry? So every time I'd be done reading, with my reading, I'd be like, she was pointing out that I was unaware of it. I was totally unaware. And what was happening was not even consciously, but I was reading it for the first time without the rose-colored glasses on. Mm-hmm. I was reading it without making excuses for what it literally says. Mm-hmm. And I was seeing the horror, honestly, of, and let me step back for a second. We would often say as Christians, the difference between the Christian God and other gods. We'd look at like Greek mythology and be like, yeah, gosh, those silly gods, they're just like people. They have emotions, and I'm reading through the Old Testament and I'm like, this is no different than every Greek god ever. This is a petty, vindictive character. And again, I wouldn't have put it in those terms at the time, but that was what was seeping through. That was what was coming through. And I just started to allow the occasional bit of information to come through, right? If I saw an article that had a specific atheist bent, I'd go ahead and read it. I wasn't convinced. It didn't change my mind, but it was just one more little drop in the bucket, right? So one of those things was I would follow Roger Ebert. I was a huge I still am a huge movie buff. In the age of Twitter, I started to follow him, and he was very much an outspoken atheist, and occasionally he would make some argument about the silliness of this or that religious claim. And so again, it's just little drips. And then, so 2015, one of those articles that I let slip through was a Greta Christina article. I don't know if you know who she is, but she's a famous atheist blogger. And she was talking about the soul and the argument of having the soul be something other than the body. And, pointing out the obvious fact that if I take a drug, I might lose consciousness. And, if I hit myself with a hammer, that, I have conscious changes based on the physical reality that I'm in. And there was this little analogy that just struck home to me. And I think she was quoting someone else, but they were saying it's like a rainbow. A rainbow is real, and you have a real perception of it, but it ultimately is a trick of the light and perspective.
Right.
And it just got through to me. It just got through to me that, I have this sense of the I am, but that recognition of, well, I am a physical being, and it's not necessary for me to add something to that. And we have to go back just one other thing. Ironically, I had really good teachers in Bible college.
I remember you talking about that.
I often say they did too good a job because they taught me critical thinking and the terms are exegesis and hermeneutics, but the way you interpret the Bible. And one of the things we often said back in the Bible college days was the Jewish conception of God was a very real physical thing. So when they talked about the Spirit, their imagery was of the wind, this strong physical thing, this real thing. And due to the impact of just a historical quirk, the Gnostic thinkers in the early part of the church, we got this idea of dualism. The spirit is good and the flesh is evil. And ironically, the first church fathers really fought against this. That was heresy. And yet modern day evangelicalism is Gnostic through and through, right? And so this recognition of I'm a physical being and it's not necessary for me to add a soul to that was kind of the last straw. And then almost immediately in succession, the last thing I hung on to, the thing I had held on to for dear life, was the idea of the resurrection. There's a passage in 1 Corinthians where Paul is talking about, he's making some other argument because there's a particular group that's saying they're still believers, but they're saying that the resurrection doesn't occur. And he says, if the resurrections can't occur, then Jesus isn't raised, and all of this is a joke.
I remember you talking about that.
So it was very, very binary for me. And the reason I bring that up is that there are people who have a very liberalized conception of Christianity and they believe in God, even though they don't believe in miracles. But for me, that the resurrection needed to be true or none of it was worthwhile. So the very last straw was when I began to look at, why do I believe in the resurrection, and recognizing that the evidence such as it was, some of this I remember telling you at the time, I wouldn't accept that same evidence in any other context, right? It was wholly insufficient for the enormity of what is being asked to be believed. And then that was it. And I've said many times, I was just done. I didn't want to go on to more progressive theologies or more liberalized theologies, because for me, it just was binary. Either this thing really, truly, honestly happened. The God-man came to earth, died literally, and literally was risen again 3 days later, or this isn't worth it. So when I let go of that, it was all over. the second part of your question is, how do you get to doing this? First of all, it took me a while to tell my wife. That was a terrifying conversation.
Yeah, I want to hear how that went.
We'll get to that in just a second.
Yeah.
When you first have this experience, you don't know the terminology, right? Like I use the word deconversion or humanist or all these words that I had no idea what those words meant. So the first thing you run across is a very dogmatic, very debate-oriented, very highly intellectualized atheism.
Right.
The horseman that we referred to earlier. And I read those books. I consumed those books. That was great. But about 15 minutes after that, you're like, okay, well, now what? And that's where things get harder, right? There are fewer voices out there talking about,
right.
Hey, we still need to have a sense of awe. We still need to have a sense of belonging. We still need to have community. We still are human beings. What does that mean? How do we do that without having to tack on a supernatural element? And so I found, the handful of voices out there that were talking about those things. And I found that that old preacher in me from way back in the day, I had to talk about these things. You know what I mean? It was one of those things where it was just killing me to keep it bottled up inside. And I, in fact, reached out to a couple of other people and said, hey, can I participate? Can I do something here? And I realized if I'm going to do something, I have a real clear sense of what voice I want, what I want to say out there to the world. And I decided that the podcast is the best way to go about that. And it's mostly for me. And I'm pretty honest about this, right? Like I have, a small audience and I'm very thankful for them, but I mostly do this because it's cathartic for me. So it's mostly just being totally selfish.
Well, that's fair, but I bet it does help some people. And so kudos for that. If you help anybody through some of this. I mean, honestly, when you told me that you were atheist, I felt a little bit guilty. Like I felt like I could have been there to, help you through this or do something or have somebody to talk to or whatever. So I'm glad you got through it. I'm sorry I wasn't there to help you.
No way, man. This is my personality in that the things that are important to me, I literally read 12, 15 books, right? Before I started to talk about it publicly at all. That's my MO. I go and do things alone. Yeah. And then I feel open about it and I start talking about it to people out in public.
So tell me about the first time that you told somebody that you used the word atheist. I'm an atheist.
Yeah.
What was that like? How did that feel?
So that was my wife, who is very much still a believer. And 3 months had gone by. I'd read, a number of books and was feeling more on solid ground of, I understand now what happened and why I no longer believe, and, had some terminology and words to be able to describe it. But I also knew that this was going to, twist the knife into our heart. And because at least ostensibly the marriage was built on a mutual faith. And so the way that I approached it was to really focus on how much I love her, and that I love her not because of the things that she believes, but because of the person that she is. Mm-hmm. I tried to, express that this doesn't invalidate the family we've built, the time we spent together, all of those things.
That must have been really, really scary.
It was terrifying. I would have not blamed her if she left, right? Because again, that was what was stated out loud, right? That the whole thing was built on this.
But it must have been a huge weight off your heart.
Yeah, yes. Yeah, I've talked to some people who have remained in relationships for long periods of time and didn't tell a significant other for years. I could not do that. I it was killing me waiting the 3 months, but it was just being terrified that made it take that long.
And was it as bad as you had feared it would be?
Yes and no. I am acutely aware of the hurt and the process that she and I had to go through to get to what now I think is pretty healthy. We have our moments. We have times where that'll flare up, but I think we've established the mutual respect is not about beliefs, right? but she handled it very well. She needed some space for a while, but came back because she has a background in psychology. She's a genius at this, but she talked about another psychologist who mentioned this concept of a second marriage within the same marriage, and specifically in the context of infidelity, but that people can rebuild a marriage after the original premise is gone, but decide to volitionally, right, decide we love each other, we want to remain together. And so we approached it from that perspective. Like, it's not going to be the same, it's different, but we do care about each other, we do love each other, and we both want to mutually to make this work.
I do have a few more kind of random questions.
Let's do it. Go.
So we talked a bit about how your family took it. Do you find that it's allowed you, being an atheist, has allowed you to develop different relationships with people that you may not have had a relationship with before?
Yes and no. So one other drop in the bucket, as it were, that had an impact on me is I had this really powerful, visceral experience listening to Sam Smith, who's a gay singer. A song is called Lay Me Down, and it is talking about just this painful need to be close to the person you love, right? Just driving painful need to be in close contact. And I thought, how can I say that is not fully love, right? How can I diminish that in any way? And so I think it's trite and trivial and privileged of me to describe that, but I had that visceral epiphany of understanding of. So what I say as becoming a secular humanist is that there just aren't any boundaries anymore. I feel no hesitation to embrace people, whoever they may be, sexual orientation, religious background.
That's good, yeah.
Nationality, what have you. None of that, all of those shackles, as it were, just came flying off.
And isn't it ironic that this is like one of the key principles of the Bible, right?
Oh yeah.
Judge not.
Yes.
Accept everybody. I mean, come on. It's like all throughout the New Testament, at least. It's all throughout. It's like the poor or the harlot. Accepting all these people, the outcasts of society. Which that part, I mean, like you said, there's parts of religion that are myth, but there is some very valuable pieces to it, and I think that's one of them, at least to me. It's like just accepting people as they are.
Absolutely. And that is what I was trying to preach, right? Was this conception of grace. Grace just means unmerited love, right?
Yeah.
Accepting and loving people for where they're at, not because they deserve it, because they're a person. And what I recognize now is that even though that message does exist, it is there, there's also all these other elements that are holding that back, right?
Yeah.
To truly love someone, you actually do need to accept them. There's this phrase in the Christian world of love the sinner, hate the sin. But that is still twisted, right? There's a caveat. You're still not truly accepting the person for who they are. You still are saying,
maybe I can change them.
Yeah, exactly. I care about you, but I think you're wrong.
I'm going to save your soul. You may not know it, but I'm going to do it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, it's ironic that there's the judgment in there is just kind of endemic in the organized religion structure. And yeah, it's a little bit hypocritical a bit. And that's always kind of sat with me if like, what the Bible says is not necessarily what organized religion promotes.
Yeah.
And so, excluding people is just it seems very anti-Christian to me.
I could not agree more. But you've brought up one other topic that I want to describe. What I've come to understand is that every single individual who says they are a believer of the Bible has their own unique interpretation of the Bible.
Right.
What I came to understand is that even though I believed in grace and I could quote you chapter and verse on why that should be the correct interpretation of the Bible. It eventually dawned on me that the bigoted, hateful, judgmental person had the exact number of verses they could quote and be justified in holding that belief based on the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
So, and an indication of this is the vast number of denominations or sects or versions of Christianity that are diametrically opposed to one another. They're all using the same
It's
source
true.
material.
Yeah, one of the most meaningful conversations I had was actually with a minister for the Methodist church I was going to. We were going out moving chopped wood for someone that had been injured or something. So the church had gone out to help this person. And I remember talking to the minister and asking her about the mythology and what her view was. And she was very progressive. And she said that, in her view in their church's view that, you can't take the Bible literally as true. You take it as a source of inspiration. And that really hit me that, not all religious people are the same.
Absolutely.
There's a wide diversity of belief there. So I really like that.
And I often say now there are better and worse versions of Christianity, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you're a progressive Christian who has open arms for everyone and you truly care about them, but for you, it's important to have a belief in God and that motivates you, more power to you, right? But then there are the versions that are hurting LGBT youth who, are in the closet because of the guilt that they feel, the shame that they feel. People like yourself, right? Somebody who doesn't believe, and that feeling of isolation. And, there's all kinds of negative effects. And there's a movement right now called ex-evangelicals. It's kind of millennials who were raised very strict Christians, evangelicals, and who now, in particular, because of the politics of the last 5 years, are just outraged, and they're very vocal about it. But my heart breaks, for some of the stories that you hear, abuse from youth pastors towards young women, again, LGBTQ kids, just, terrible, terrible stories, parents being ridiculously strict, right? To the point of abusive, right? Emotionally abusive. So their stories just break my heart. And it's for those people that I want to avoid any other kid having to go through that, right?
So the next question, so kind of on that topic of weird judgment. When I was a kid, I was really into Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah.
And this was back during the height of the D&D scare.
Yeah.
And so, I was being told that, the player's manual is a spell book and you'll commit suicide. So my question to you is, what was your experience going through that? Because we're about the same age.
Yeah. Yeah.
What was your experience going through the D&D craze?
So again, one of the, if not unique, at least rarer aspects of my story is that I really did grow up in a nominally Christian family. There were passing references to God, and they believed in Jesus, and they would talk about it occasionally. But I joke that like Douglas Adams, I would always bring up who is this God character anyway? I was always similar to your questions to me. I was always asking the occasional family member, what do you think, right? And so when I became a born again, and I'm using scare quotes, Christian, at about 16, 17 years old, I wasn't an adult by any stretch of the imagination, but I had a sense of who I was as a person, and I still believed in science. I didn't throw those things away. I recognize now that I have always had a skeptical nature, right? Like I was the internal critic whilst I was in it. Now I'm an external critic, but the satanic panic of particularly the 80s, I kind of missed because it was really at the end of that is when I became a Christian. But the experiences that I did have were social pressure to get rid of secular music, burning your secular music, right?
Oh, right.
Being shamed about, maybe the movies that I wanted to watch. Like I mentioned earlier, I'm a movie buff. I'm always watching movies, and it didn't matter what it was rated or what it was about. If it was good, I was into it. But I knew that wasn't entirely acceptable within the community that I was part of. Interestingly, I was just recently talking to Amy Logan, who is a former Mormon, and she was talking about a very ritualized experience where they do these worthiness interviews. And I was saying the difference in evangelicalism is that there's just as much judgment about worthiness, but it's implicit. These are unwritten rules, and you don't know them until you cross the line, and then you get socially shamed or what have you. And so there were definitely those aspects. I don't think I could have said, hey, I love Dungeons and Dragons, and have people go, oh, that's fine. Right. I think there would have been judgment for that.
Yeah, I did have religious friends that played Dungeons and Dragons, but I also had religious friends that was like a tool of the devil.
Right. Yes.
So and you mentioned about music too. I wonder, what is the motivation from the organized religion to what is the thinking of like to put these impositions on people? Like on the face of it, it seems like they're worried that you're going to be tempted to demonic whatever. But I also wonder if part of it is a control aspect of like, if we can control you to not do this thing that you want to do, then we control you other ways. What's your thought on that?
Very, very insightful question. There's a few things going on there that I think make that happen. Number one, research has shown is basically the higher the demand, the religion or organization, really, you can think of a gang in the same way. The higher demand that it is for a community, the stronger that bond is, the more connected you feel to that group, and the harder it is to dissent or leave. Two is what I call the race to the bottom. You probably are familiar with the phrase, so spiritually minded that they're no earthly good.
I haven't heard that, actually.
That may be within charismatic or Pentecostal traditions.
Okay.
But we say that, and yet the person who is the most vocal, the most restrictive on themselves, the most restrictive for the people around them, they are lifted up as the spiritual giants. Instead of the person who is out feeding the poor, being kind and visiting the homeless, right? It's the person who makes the most demands or appears to have the most demands on themselves that is seen as the most spiritual.
Most pious.
Yeah, the most pious person. So that's a race to the bottom in many ways. And I think that has a negative cycle to build a social context that demands unnecessary restrictions on people. And then the third thing is, you can see this in history, the traditions about traditions. So these meta traditions. So the Jewish Midrash is the best example of this. This is all the rules about how not to break the commandments. But in other words, like, I don't even want to get close to breaking God's commandment. So I'm going to have all these rules that place me way beyond that boundary. And so within the mindset, it's these human rules in order to protect you from getting to one of God's rules. But ultimately, all of that has a destructive aspect to it of shaming and judging people.
Do you still go to church with your wife?
I occasionally do. One of the conversation that we had was, she basically said, I need you to go. You said you would. I'm going to hold you to that. And I said, okay. Ironically, right at the moment, she is between churches. So we haven't for a bit. I have described this a number of times of how bizarre it is. The rose-colored glasses are off. And so when I do go, the manipulation is really loud in my ears, right? Like something that I just filtered out, that I just didn't notice before, suddenly becomes just painfully obvious. Because I mentioned earlier, truth matters to me. There's a joke about Christians don't tell lies, they sing them. So as much as I love singing, and in particular communal singing, early on I thought, I can't sing these songs because they are saying things that are not true. And so I'll generally just be there being very quiet. One of the ironies, though, is, I have a Bible college education, so I actually know the Bible. And so, if a preacher is talking about a particular passage, I will break open my phone app and, open the Bible up and read the context and, be following along from a interpretation perspective very, very closely. And as you might imagine, I have some opinions.
Do you ever talk to the minister about that?
I haven't done that. The church that my wife was a part of, because she was so very much involved, several of the leaders know that I'm an atheist now. And there were a couple of attempts to reach out to me, but it was mostly of, do you want to talk to anyone? And my response was, are you sure they want to talk to me? This is a fascinating thing for me personally. I've told my individual, really close friends, I haven't made the really public Facebook post. With the exception of one aunt, almost no one has asked me why.
Hmm.
Almost no one has wanted to have the conversation of, what were your reasons, David, for deciding that you no longer believe? That almost has not happened. Now, I know that many other people have different experience, that they get questioned all the time.
Yeah.
For me, everyone has basically just ignored it.
Why do you think that is?
I think we were talking about earlier that the people who knew me, knew that I was very dedicated, that I was very serious, that I believe very deeply. And if I can deconvert, then that is threatening. That's scary.
Yeah.
That's the only thing I can say. I don't want to
Guess at people's.
guess at people's intentions, that kind of
Right.
thing, or assert that about them. But that's the only thing I can guess at.
Well, that'd be my guess too.
Yeah.
I mean, that's, in my experience, like telling someone that you're an atheist is like it's like an attack.
Yeah.
Right. Like if you say you're agnostic, well, I don't know, maybe not. That's not threatening, right?
Yeah.
But to say, yeah, God does not exist, then that forces them to deal with this question that they either consciously or subconsciously must be dealing with themselves, and they don't want to.
Yeah.
So that's very uncomfortable for them.
Right.
Then it becomes uncomfortable for you.
That's right.
So what do you see your next steps? What's your goal going forward? Like, do you want to talk to more people about?
So do you mean specifically about family and friends, or just in general?
Yeah, family and friends.
I've got a blog post that I wrote where I talked about the analogy of the magic feather that Dumbo has. And I don't want this to be derogatory. I don't mean this in a derogatory way. The story, if you recall, he can fly. He's got giant ears. He can fly. But he doesn't know that he can fly. And another character gives him a quote unquote magic feather. There's no magic in this feather. It gives him the confidence, and then he can fly. And this is why it's not derogatory, because that is exactly my story. When I was that 16-year-old kid, I had dropped out of high school. I didn't have any prospects for making a living. I was in poverty at the time, and really, really, really hopeless. So there's an aspect of, this is common. People either are indoctrinated as children, or out of desperation, they reach out to religion. So I was definitely in the latter category. I had a transformation. I had somebody, a youth pastor who, again, when I look back now, it was that he just believed in me, right? He just cared enough to say, you're smart, you should go do this. And he said, you could do Bible college, you should go do it. I was like, okay, that sounds good to me. And so I had, what I describe as, for me, the magic feather was having this sense of purpose, a sense of God has my back. I'm not alone in this. That gave me a tremendous amount of confidence to go and be a preacher, to go study, what have you. I tell that story to say this. What I end that blog post with is, if someone had forcibly taken the magic feather away from me then, it would have been devastating. I don't know if I'd be here today with the career I have and all those things, the beautiful wife and kids that I have, had someone yanked that out of my hands at the time. That is how I approach it, in that the believers in my family and friends, if they have questions, they know I'm available, right? When they have the desire to actually hear the answers to those questions, they'll come to me. And ironically, I learned some of this from being on the other side of trying to evangelize people. You cannot change someone's mind, right? You can be the person that's dropping those drops in the bucket, or the straws on the camel's back, and maybe you happen to be there and you get to see it happen, but rarely does that occur. You can't change people's minds. What you can do is give them information. And so what I often do is I talk about my values. with my family, and where we have lots of common ground on our values. And look, see, we all care about
Our kids.
Volunteering. We care about the kids. We care about this group of disenfranchised people and how can we help them, and what have you, right? Whatever your values are, and just having conversations centered around that, values instead of beliefs.
Well, I would encourage you, don't be shy about talking to us. I have, as I've gotten older and I've talked to some of my family that is religious, like sometimes they don't want to talk to me because they don't want to offend me.
Right.
And so if I broach the topic, then we can talk about it a little bit. So I'd encourage you, like, don't feel afraid to talk to people.
Yeah. With my kids, we often have lots and lots of critical thinking discussions, right? So whatever the topic of the day is, it doesn't have to, it's not about religion, right? It's just whatever it is.
Right.
And, I'll often say to them, I don't want to tell you what to believe, but I can teach you some skills on how to think, right?
If I believe in anything, it's thinking. Like, I don't care what what you believe or how you've gotten to, whatever. I want to know that you are thinking about it and you're not just blindly accepting whatever it is.
Right.
Even if it's something I agree with, if you're just accepting it and you're not questioning it, you're not really thinking about it.
Right.
But anybody that is putting some effort into thinking about whatever it is that they do and they believe and they practice, I admire that.
Yeah.
But it's when the thinking gets turned off. And I think that's the thing I dislike about religion, is that a lot of times it kind of teaches you to turn off the thinking, don't ask questions.
Yeah.
And I think that's just bad for us as a society.
I completely agree. There's a saying, conversation ending pat answers. And that's kind of what you experienced as a kid, right? You were asking valid questions that you truly wanted to know the answer to, but you received conversation ending pat answers, and that is not healthy. What I talked about earlier about there's plenty of people sitting in pews that don't believe. There's also plenty of people who are racked by guilt for the doubt that they feel. They're having perfectly natural, perfectly human doubt, but they feel guilty about it. And part of that is because when they ask valid questions, they get pat answers instead of at least acknowledging that the question is valid.
Yeah, it hurts.
Bryce, I really appreciate the time. I think this is maybe one of my favorite conversations so far, mostly because I got to talk the whole time.
Well, I've gotten a lot of questions answered, so thank you.
I'm sure we'll continue this conversation offline, but I want to acknowledge, though, how insightful the questions were, right? I think you really got to some very, very important insights. And for the listeners, Bryce and I didn't prepare this at all. This was spontaneous entirely. Your experience growing up, that feeling alone, not being satisfied with those answers, I guarantee there's people out there that feel exactly the same way. So you've done something important here today. Thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Oh, thank you. And yeah, I felt alone my entire life. And so it's very warming to see that there are other atheists, and that there's a lot of us. It feels very inclusive to be with other people.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Final thoughts on the episode. Well, I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Bryce as much as I did. It gave me a rare opportunity to really tell my story in fullness rather than in 15-second clips. Bryce again showed a tremendous amount of insight in the questions that he asked and the way that he asked them. Again, if you were a believer, maybe one or two of those questions might have come across as offensive, but they were honestly come by, and you need to hear them from a person who has been a non-believer for all of his life. Bryce's personal story broke my heart. The isolation that he felt, the loneliness, and even at the very end of our conversation, he mentions that all of his life he's felt isolated, and he feels very comforted to know that there's a community of non-believers are out there. I was particularly struck by Bryce's discussion of public prayer, and I think he was intimating that he has felt obligated at times to pretend that he was praying. I'm certain that many of you out there have experienced something very similar, and we each need to come to a decision on how we handle those situations. Bryce was, again, the first person ever to indicate to me the prejudice against atheists way back when I was very much in the evangelical bubble. And I thank him for that. I think that was a really valuable lesson for me and ultimately, in some ways, helped me along in my deconversion. If you're like Bryce, if you're one of those people who has been a non-believer and you're surrounded by believers and you feel isolated, the main purpose of this podcast is to say to you, you are not alone. There are many, many of us out there. I want to thank Bryce again for his honesty, his vulnerability, his willingness to ask really interesting questions, as well as, and I think you'll agree with me, the incredible graciousness that he had, not only with me today in this conversation, but the conversation that we referred to all the way back in 2012. Bryce was genuinely curious about my belief at the time. He was respectfully interested in how I had come to those conclusions. And so that same integrity and gracefulness you can hear as he's interviewing me today about my deconversion. Obviously, I think Bryce is a wonderful person. I hope that you enjoyed my conversation with him as well. If you have a deconversion story, or if you have been a non-believer for a long time and you feel isolated and you want to tell some of that story, please get in touch with me at gracefulatheist@gmail.com. A quick hint about the next upcoming episodes. I have 2 really amazing interviews that are in the pipeline. I have interviewed already Bart Campolo, the podcast host of Humanize Me, and of course, the son of famous evangelical preacher Tony Campolo. That's coming up next. And then I'm also about to interview Leanne Lord. She is the new co-host of Point of Inquiry podcast. She is a stand-up comedian. She is an author. She's been Humanist of the Year. She's got an amazing career, and we'll be talking about comedy and humanism and Black Lives Matter. Until then, I am David, and I am trying to be the Graceful Atheist. Join me and be graceful human beings. Time for some footnotes. The song is a track called Waves by Micaiah Beats. Please check out her music. Links will be in the show notes. If you'd like to help support the podcast, here are the ways you can go about that. First, help promote it. The podcast's audience grows by word of mouth. If you found it useful or just entertaining, please pass it on to your friends and family. Post about it on social media so that others can find it. Please rate and review the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. This will help raise the visibility of our show. Join me on the podcast. Tell your story. Have you gone through a faith transition? You want to tell that to the world? Let me know and let's have you on. Do you know someone who needs to tell their story? Let them know. Do you have criticisms about atheism or humanism, but you're willing to have an honesty contest with me? Come on the show. If you have a book or a blog that you want to promote, I'd like to hear from you. Also, you can contribute technical support. If you are good at graphic design, sound engineering, or marketing, please let me know and I'll let you know how you can participate. And finally, financial support. There will be a link on the show notes to allow contributions which would help defray the cost of producing the show. If you want to get in touch with me, you can Google Graceful Atheist, or you can send email to gracefulatheist@gmail.com. You can tweet at me at gracefulatheist, or you can just check out my website at gracefulatheist.wordpress.com. Get in touch and let me know if you appreciate the podcast. Well, this has been the Graceful Atheist podcast. My name is David, and I am trying to be the Graceful Atheist. Grab somebody you love and tell them how much they mean to you. This has been the Graceful Atheist Podcast.